Welcome. Today we walk a road that classical analysis has carefully mapped, integration on the real line, but this time with the Lebesgue framework in hand. And we will see that this road holds a few surprises. Some functions the classical theory would have set aside turn out to be perfectly integrable here, and that is only the first. The setting we work in is much broader than Riemann's, and slide after slide, we'll uncover why that wider view is worth the detour. Here is the plan. We will see three things. First, how all of classical analysis, Newton-Leibniz, integration by parts, change of variables, Taylor, survives, sometimes strengthened, in the Lebesgue framework. Second, how to decide quickly whether an integral converges, even in the face of singularities or oscillations. And third, how to give rigorous mathematical meaning to objects that resist classical integration. Before we build the technical tools, a fundamental shift of perspective. Integration is no longer just a computational technique, it becomes an operation that regularizes functions. And in the Lebesgue framework, this operation goes further. It survives where the classical integral gives up. This lecture is part of the book, Measure Theory, Probability, and Stochastic Processes, an integrated approach. After 2 lectures building the Lebesgue integral in the abstract setting of measurable spaces, we now come down to the real line, the home ground of classical analysis. Here we recast its classical results, first proved for the Riemann integral, in the broader Lebesgue framework. Our guide for the classical version is the classic French text by Riemann and colleagues. And one convention from the outset. Unless stated otherwise, integrability always refers to the Lebesgue measure. We now enter the first technical section, the basic properties of the integral on the real line. 4 themes come together here. The shall relation, the integral function and its regularity, antiderivatives, and the mean value formulas, our toolkit for estimates. A small but indispensable technical point before we go further. Throughout the lecture we use the oriented integral notation, the one with explicit lower and upper bounds on the integral sign. When the lower bound is less than or equal to the upper bound, the oriented integral coincides with the Lebesgue integral over the open interval. When the bounds are in the reverse order, we flip the sign, exactly as in the Riemann calculus you remember. With this convention in place, everything that follows can be written cleanly, without case distinctions on the order of the bounds. The shall relation says, simply, that integrating from one point to another can be split through any intermediate point. Thanks to the oriented notation, it holds whatever the order of the 3 points. It applies to any measurable function whose integral is well defined, real or vector valued. With one caveat the slide makes precise. The pieces must not combine into an indeterminate infinity minus infinity. The general many-point version follows by the same principle. Fix a locally integrable function, choose one endpoint, and let the other vary. What you get is the integral function. The starting function may be quite irregular, discontinuous, unbounded near a point. The integral function built from it is far more regular. Integration smooths things out, and the next slide makes that precise. The key idea to carry away is that integration acts as a regularizing operation. The precise statements are summarized on the slide. Start with a function that may be highly discontinuous. Integrate it, and the result is continuous everywhere. More remarkably, it is differentiable almost everywhere, with its derivative recovering the original function at those points. The Lebesgue framework is what makes this phenomenon both precise and fully general. Now we reverse the question. Instead of integrating a function, we ask whether there exists a function whose derivative is the given one, an antiderivative. This is a purely differential notion, with no integral involved. And once you have found one antiderivative on an interval, you have found them all. Every other antiderivative differs from it by nothing more than a constant. The previous result told us how antiderivatives are related to one another, but not whether they actually exist. For continuous functions, this theorem answers that question. They always do. Better still, the integral function defined from a given starting point is the unique antiderivative that vanishes at that point. This is the bridge between integration and differentiation, the classical fundamental theorem of calculus in our setting. Take the simplest discontinuous example, the indicator of the unit segment. Its integral function is continuous everywhere, and the figure shows it clearly. Where the original function jumps, The new one simply forms a corner. It recovers the step function almost everywhere, but not at the two corner points. And that is exactly why no everywhere differentiable antiderivative can exist here. We now turn to estimation. The basic inequality is straightforward but fundamental. If a function is essentially bounded, then the size of its integral is controlled by the length of the interval times that bound. The same idea works for scalar and vector-valued functions. This is the starting point for almost every practical estimate. The first mean value formula sharpens that inequality. With a weight of constant sign, the weighted integral must lie between the extreme values of the function. And if the function is continuous on a compact interval, that average is actually reached at some point. When the weight is simply 1, we recover the classical mean value theorem for integrals. The second mean value formula is more specialized. Here the weight is positive and decreasing, and the conclusion rewrites the integral by concentrating that weight at the left endpoint, up to a suitable cut point inside the interval. We highlight it because it will drive Abel's rule later, when we study oscillating improper integrals. We now move from structure to computation. Newton-Leibniz, integration by parts, change of variables, and Taylor's formula. Here is the central bridge. For a continuous function on a compact interval, the integral is the difference of an antiderivative at the endpoints. This is the familiar fundamental theorem of calculus, linking integration with differentiation, and it lets us actually compute integrals rather than just reason about them. Integration by parts is simply the product rule, translated into integral form. The slide also gives a broader bilinear version, which covers many familiar cases at once: inner products, matrix products, and similar pairings. One general identity, many concrete applications. Change of variables appears in two forms. The first is the classical monotone substitution. The second is the more striking one. Monotonicity is no longer required. In the Riemann setting, that is a delicate matter, because the interval can fold back on itself. In the Lebesgue framework, the convergence theorems make the result much more transparent. A classical family now. The Wallace integrals, built from powers of the sign. Three facts matter most. They satisfy a simple two-step recurrence. Sine and cosine play perfectly symmetric roles. And the closed formulas split according to whether the exponent is even or odd. Their decay for large exponent is also the starting point of several classical asymptotic results, including Stirling's formula. We close the section with Taylor's formula in its most useful exact form, the one with an integral remainder. Instead of hiding the error at some unknown intermediate point, it writes that error explicitly. So the remainder is not just bounded, it is given in a form we can work with directly. The remark adds a convenient reparametrization on the unit interval. We now ask a different question, not how to compute an integral, but how to tell whether it exists by comparison. The first test is the simplest one. If two non-negative functions satisfy an inequality, then integrability passes from the larger to the smaller, and divergence passes in the opposite direction. The corollary localizes the idea. The comparison only needs to hold near the troublesome point, which is exactly where the question is decided. We now move from direct inequalities to asymptotic comparison. If a function is dominated near the critical point by an integrable reference, then it is integrable as well. And if two functions are asymptotically equivalent there, then they share the same integrability behavior. In practice, this lets us replace a complicated expression by its leading term. So far, comparison told us about integrability. Next, we ask whether those comparison relations also survive after integration. When the reference function is integrable, the key object is its tail, the remaining mass from a moving point to the endpoint. The theorem says that big O, little o, and asymptotic equivalence all pass to these tails. The corollary gives the parallel statement for integral functions near a finite point. A very useful consequence follows. If a function has a Taylor expansion of some order near a point, then its integral function has one order more, obtained simply by integrating term by term and carrying the remainder along. The example gives the cleanest case. A function comparable to a power leads to an integral comparable to the next power. Now take the opposite situation, where the reference function is not integrable. Then the tail is no longer the right quantity, because it diverges. What matters instead is the growth of the partial integral, And once again, big O, little o, and equivalence all pass through integration. Same philosophy, but now growth replaces remainder. To use comparison well, we need reference functions whose behavior we know by heart. The first family is the power scale, and these lemmas give the complete threshold, at infinity and near a finite boundary. The figure makes the contrast easy to see. The critical exponent is the same, but the integrable side flips from one setting to the other. Putting the comparison theorems together with the power scale gives practical rules you can use immediately. At infinity or near a finite boundary, the method is always the same. Compare the function with a suitable power, then read off the verdict from the known threshold. These are the everyday tools behind most quick integrability checks. This slide collects typical examples: a damped oscillation, the Gauss integral, rational functions at infinity, and several algebraic singularities. The details differ, but the strategy never changes. Find the dominant behavior, compare it with a known reference, and the answer follows. The real lesson is the unity of the method. 2 useful warnings. First, if a function tends to a non-zero limit at infinity, it cannot be integrable. But the converse is false. An integrable function need not tend to 0 at infinity. The spike example on the slide makes that clear. The total area stays finite, even though the function becomes arbitrarily large near every integer. When powers alone leave us at a borderline case, logarithms provide the next refinement. That is the Bertrand scale, a power corrected by a logarithm. The 2 lemmas tabulate exactly when these reference functions are integrable, at infinity and near 0. And if needed, the same idea continues with iterated logarithms. We now enter the setting where the Lebesgue integral may fail, but a limiting process still produces a meaningful value. Here is the emblematic example, seen of t over t on the half line. The function is continuous and well-behaved pointwise, yet its Lebesgue integral does not exist, because the positive and negative parts have both infinite integrals. The figure shows why this is still salvageable. The oscillations cancel more and more, and the running integral settles toward a finite limit. The definition is the natural one. For a locally integrable function on a half-open interval, possibly extending to infinity, we integrate over bounded subintervals, and then let the moving endpoint approach the problematic bound. If that limit exists, we call it the improper integral. In the vector case, this is done component by component. How does this relate to the Lebesgue integral? Whenever the Lebesgue integral is well defined, the improper integral exists and gives the same value. So the improper notion is an extension, not a rival theory. The two differ only when cancellation creates a finite limit, even though the positive and negative parts are separately infinite. Exactly the phenomenon seen with sinc. 2 easy but important cases are settled here. For positive functions, there is no mystery. No cancellation is possible, so convergence of the improper integral is exactly the same as ordinary integrability. For vector-valued functions, everything proceeds component-wise, and the usual norm estimate still holds. The norm of the integral is bounded by the integral of the norm. This remark connects our language with the classical Riemann terminology. What Riemann calls an improper integral is what we call a convergent improper integral. Semi-convergence means convergence without Lebesgue integrability. And absolute convergence is simply genuine Lebesgue integrability. So the old vocabulary fits neatly into the broader measure-theoretic picture. The same compensation can occur at a finite endpoint. This example shows a function near 0 whose improper integral converges, even though the function is not Lebesgue integrable there. The change of variable on the slide ties it directly to sinc on the half line. So the mechanism is the same, only compressed into a bounded interval. Now come the structural properties. The functions with a convergent improper integral form a vector space, and the improper integral is linear on that space. It also commutes with linear maps, and can be checked component by component. In other words, the familiar linear algebra of the Lebesgue integral carries over unchanged. Because we work in complete spaces, convergence of the improper integral is equivalent to a Cauchy criterion. Concretely, the integral converges exactly when integrals, over sufficiently small intervals, near the critical point, can all be made uniformly small. This criterion is especially useful because it does not require knowing the limit in advance, and it prepares the ground for Abel's rule. Abel's rule is the standard test for oscillating integrals. Take a function whose partial integrals stay bounded. Multiply it by a positive decreasing weight that goes to 0, and the product converges in the improper sense. The intuition, the oscillations keep cancelling, and the decaying weight makes each successive contribution smaller, until the integral settles. The slide lists two classical examples on the half-line, the Dirichlet integral and the Fresnel integral. The last refinement handles open intervals, where both endpoints may be problematic. We choose any interior point, split the interval there, and add the two one-sided improper integrals, provided no infinity minus infinity ambiguity appears. The lemma tells us this does not depend on the cut point, so the construction is intrinsic and well-defined. We now extend the main computational tools to the improper setting: antiderivatives, change of variables, and integration by parts. Newton-Leibniz extends in the expected way. A continuous function on an open interval always has an antiderivative. The improper integral exists exactly when that antiderivative has limits at the two ends, and those two limits do not produce an infinity minus infinity. The value is then their difference. The examples on the slide show both outcomes: one finite case with the logarithm, and one divergent case with 1 over t. Change of variables also survives in the improper setting. First comes the monotone diffeomorphism case, which is the direct analogue of the bounded interval theorem. Then comes the more general version, where monotonicity is dropped under suitable endpoint conditions. As before, the Lebesgue framework lets one result cover situations that classical treatments often handle separately. These two examples show what a good substitution can do. In the first, a logarithmic change turns a singular integral on the unit interval into a familiar Cauchy-type integral on a half-line. In the second, a quadratic change removes a square root singularity altogether. The figure makes that one visible. A spike becomes a smooth curve, with exactly the same area. Integration by parts extends as well, both in the scalar case and in the bilinear vector setting. The endpoint term must have finite limits, and once one of the two integrals exists, the formula gives the other. In practice, this is especially useful for weakening singularities at an endpoint, and for deriving recurrences on unbounded intervals. We have reached the end of the technical development. Let us briefly gather the main ideas and look ahead. Let us recap. This lecture built a complete toolkit for integration on the real line in the Lebesgue framework, computing integrals, deciding when they exist, and handling improper integrals. What comes next is the natural continuation, probability, which, in the measure-theoretic view, is this same framework applied to probability measures. A brief word on sources. The way we handled integration on the real line here, comparing the integral with antiderivatives and giving meaning to improper integrals, follows the classical presentation of Riemann and colleagues in the third volume of their treatise. There it is built on the Riemann integral. What we did was recast that same material in the Lebesgue framework. The material itself is drawn from the book Measure Theory, Probability and Stochastic Processes, an Integrated Approach. Beyond the treatise we just mentioned, one further classical reference: Rudin's Real and Complex Analysis, the source for the Lebesgue differentiation theorem. The full bibliography is in the book. This course was prepared by Mohammed Kadem Kare. Thank you for your attention.